Good afternoon and welcome to Carnegie for our Sioux Falls City Council informational meeting. Today's date is Tuesday, November 19th. Welcome to everybody here at Carnegie, those watching perhaps on CityLink or web streaming live. We have a few agenda items today. We're going to start with our Public Services Committee, and I believe Councillor Anderson Jr. has a report from that committee meeting last week.
Thank you, Chair. Public Services Committee meeting was held last Tuesday, November 12, 2013 at 5:09. After being called to order and review of minutes, we had a presentation on proposed ordinance updates to Chapter 38, Elections. With that, we are basically just updating the ordinance to reflect state law, and we'll continue to work on that. The second item was water management philosophy given to us by our Utilities Operation Administrator Trent Lubers and Greg Anderson, the Water Superintendent. They provided a PowerPoint presentation on the city's water philosophy and discussed different items as far as making sure that the city always has water for people to drink and utilize. The third item on the agenda was the taxi cab ordinance review. This is something that Public Services has been working on, and I thank my colleagues on Public Services. It's been a really long road on this, and we found out that, number one, the taxi cab companies do not get along, and that also that there's an ordinance that has been out there for a quite long time. There's been technology upgrades, and the number of cab companies that are now operating in Sioux Falls. We're just trying to make some changes to that ordinance to make sure that everyone's on the same playing field. And I feel that we're getting very close to that, and I hope that sometime here at the beginning of the year we'll pass this on to the City Council for consideration. After that, we had an open discussion, but that was very short because of the length of time that we spent on the taxis, and then there was an adjournment.
Any questions for Councillor Anderson? Councillor Staggers.
Yes, you mentioned about wanting to make this a fair playing field. So that seems to imply it's not fair right now. In what ways is it not fair right now?
Well, number one is technology. Some companies are using technology that is not approved by the city, is not in ordinance, and is not in ordinance for the state. We're trying to get everyone to use the same equipment, number one. Number two is oversight. There is absolutely no oversight by the city. That is a problem. If we don't know who's out there operating as a cab company, because there could be some out there that are not licensed, and how they're operating as far as employees against contractor drivers. These are things that need to be known, and making sure that these companies are operating within not only city law but state law. So that's some of the things that we're looking at and making sure that the ordinance does cover.
Any other questions? Councillor Jameson.
Just listening over here, I would think the word consistent is a better word than leveling the playing field. Just based on Kermit's question, but I get what you're after. I was there, sat through the committee meeting. It was, if I could refer to it like opening a can of worms. There's a lot of pieces moving, and it's a monstrous task. And I'm glad it's in your committee, and I think you'll do fine.
No, Councillor
Councillor Erpenbach.
I just wanted to add to that conversation just a little bit. I would also call it a level the playing field for consumers, because we're finding all kinds of things that are happening to consumers because, again, as Councillor Anderson said, there's no enforcement over what's happening now. And so we're looking at that idea that it needs to be fair and consistent for consumers. The other thing then I was going to ask, and maybe you said it, Councillor Anderson, we are having a working session, and I was trying to remember the day. It is December 10th, after the informational meeting.
Correct. It'll be the regular Tuesday that we normally have the Public Services Committee meeting, but instead of the meeting, it will be more of a work session so that we can discuss over the ordinance changes with the entire council and
No, just with the committee. It's not ready for prime time
yet. It's not
yet.
ready for prime time yet. You are correct. But just to go over a few things that need to be worked on yet. And like I said, I think we're getting very close, and the information that we've been given over the last year, you know, really, we've been looking at this for almost a full year now. And the information we have given the owners, the drivers, and the public many opportunities to have their input. I have personally met with several of the cab owners and other citizens who have concerns. I feel that we have done our due diligence on this, and it's time to hunker down and get this done.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Staggers?
Yeah, I was just curious, Kenny, on this ordinance. A number of months ago, it's been a long time ago, I was contacted by one of the owners of one of the taxi cabs, and he wanted me to basically support some legislation to eliminate competition. Now, is this where a lot of this was motivated from? Because I've never really heard any complaints from consumers or anything like this, but definitely from the taxi cab owner.
We have gotten some complaints from the consumers. Where it originally started at was cab companies came to us and were asking us to take a look at the ordinance. They also wanted us to take a look at how some of these cab companies were operating, because they felt that they were operating outside of the law, that they weren't paying their rightful taxes. And so it was something that we decided to take a look at. And as we started to look at it, we started seeing more and more problems with the way the ordinance is written at this time. So basically, this isn't to put anybody out of business. This is just basically to make sure that everybody is operating under the same rules.
Thank you.
All righty. We'll move on then. We're to the point where we're going to open discussion from the councilors. Anybody have any city council open discussion that they would like to bring up? Well, I do have one thing. On this Saturday, we are all invited at 9 a.m. to be right here in Carnegie for a coffee with the council. And that will be a public forum, open forum, just anybody would like to have issues or discussion with council members. We welcome you all here. And I believe all the councilors will be here, so look forward to that. Councilor Alfing, you have something?
Yes, I just want to report that Dave Bixler and Lori Hogstad and I returned from Seattle on late Saturday night from the National Council of Cities, and we came away with some very good things, and we'll look forward to reporting on them probably next information or whenever you'd like.
I believe, yeah. I know between Mr. Bixler and probably Lori and you that there'll be a nice detailed report on
I have
how.
a 5-pager if you want me to
5
read
page?
it
No.
through.
We'll look forward to the condensed version if you don't mind. Yeah.
Reader's Digest, thank you.
But we do look forward to your report. So, okay. Any other open discussion? All righty. So we'll move into our presentations. First of all, our October monthly financial report. Director Turbach, we are all looking forward to this. Doesn't get any more exciting.
Are they on, Denise? Okay. Good afternoon. Tracy Turbach with the Finance Office. Glad to know I've got kind of a kindred spirit on the City Council. Dean loves this stuff as much as I do, apparently. All right, we'll review our October monthly financial report, which, as you know, is largely kind of an economic review of what's going on here locally, and then a high-level review of our city general fund and kind of the progress that we've made to this point in the year. The unemployment picture, I'm not sure what it is today because the federal government was shut down in the first part of October, and so no new economic data was released. We do anticipate that before the end of this month, we'll see the September and October data come out. So the most recent information we have is still for the month of August, which reflected a local unemployment rate of 3%. So we'll look forward to getting that updated information here in the next couple of weeks. Building permit data is no secret. The building permit activity has just been going gangbusters pretty much from the get-go this year. Year to date through October, the Building Services Department has issued over $539 million worth of building permits compared to a number through the end of October last year of about $382 million. So it's an increase of more than $156 million for the first 10 months of this year. It's over a 40% increase. So it's just really, as I say, going gangbusters. You know that by the end of September, a month ago, we had exceeded all of last year, and by the end of October now, we've exceeded what had been kind of the high water mark, the year 2007 pre-recession numbers. So we are certainly seeing a strong level of activity in the construction business. Sales tax data continues to look very good. You can see on this chart that the rolling 12-month growth rate has really began to accelerate about 6 months ago, last spring. In April, it started to move upward. Prior to that, we had been, for about a 2-year period of time, we'd been at about a 5% growth rate and just rolling along month after month, pretty much at that 5% growth rate until about April of this year. We saw it start to pick up, and now the most recent data indicates our sales tax revenues over the last year have grown at more than 7.5%. So that's very, very positive, and just incidentally is really ahead of what we had been seeing pre-recession. I pulled up the numbers for a 10-year average. Prior to the 2008 recession, we were running at just over 6% growth on an average basis. So we're certainly can say that economically anyway, in a lot of ways, we've recovered quite well from the recession. Entertainment tax revenues have kind of gone the other kind of a mirror image of the general sales taxes. They were running at a much higher growth rate earlier, about a year or so ago, and now have settled in recent months at about a 5% growth rate. And you can see over the last 12 months, we've got about a 5.3% growth rate going with our entertainment tax dollars. So certainly a positive level of growth, a positive rate of growth, but it is, I think, interesting that it is that the general sales taxes and general economy is running at a higher growth rate than that narrow bedboard and booze tax. Looking at the general fund data through the first 10 months of the year, on the left-hand side, the revenue year-to-date, you can see we're tracking for 2013 ahead of where we were a year ago, which we would certainly expect. We're at just under $100 million in revenue through the first 10 months of the year, which puts us at 77% of our budgeted revenues. A year ago through October, we were at 73%, so we're certainly tracking well in regard to our revenues. And that's really, I think, due to two things. One is that sales tax revenues are coming in higher than anticipated in the budget. And then, of course, the federal FEMA money that we received earlier this year as a result of the ice storm in the spring. On the right-hand side, the expenditure budget is also running ahead of where we were last year, again, which was certainly expected. Through October, we've got general fund expenditures of $109.8 million. Puts us at 78% of our budget expended. Last year we were at 77%, and that, of course, is due largely to the additional costs incurred related to Operation Timber Strike. So very much on track on or ahead of budget in regard to the revenues. So looking very, very positive for the general fund. With that, I'd be happy to entertain whatever questions you folks might have today.
Questions of Tracy? Councillor Jameson.
Tracy, the presentation you give is always usually pretty easy to follow, and everything looks great. I just had a question about your thoughts looking forward with the with all this building that's going on and all these new homes and construction that's going on, the impact that it'll have to the community later when this new building turns into real estate taxes that are getting paid. Help me understand the cycle of that, when that really will come back to really roost again for the community.
Right. It because of the property tax process and bringing new property onto the tax rolls, it does take a certain amount of time. There is a lag time between the time construction actually takes place and the city sees any new revenue from that. It actually takes about a 2-year time lag because of that. The property is finished, and all properties in South Dakota are assessed as of November 1st, and so the County Equalization Office and the State Department of Revenue will measure all property as of November 1st. So if a property isn't actually finished as of November 1st, it won't be assessed at full value until another year later. And then those valuations go through, as you folks know, an equalization process. So in the spring, the county sends out a notice to every property owner of what their assessed value is. So new property gets a notice in the spring, just like every previously existing properties. And so they've got the opportunity as a new property owner to go through that equalization process. So there's no actual tax bill that's generated until then the following January. So it really can stretch out into a 2-year time frame before the city actually sees any new revenues off new property. That's an important thing, I think, for all of us to keep in mind.
Other questions? I have one or two, if I could. On the sales tax collections, we just had a sales tax audit of First Transit, and we got some money back, spent some, got some back, basically. Is that money reflected in this? Is that why the bump this month, or is that not yet reflected?
No, to show the, if I can back up to that, that graphic. You'll notice the heading indicates is without audit. So we filter out those things that might tend to distort it from one month to the next, because audits, like the one you're referring to, went back 5.5 years. So there's actually revenue that should have been collected by the state for more than a 5-year period of time, and to dump all that into 1 month, in my view anyway, would skew it. So we take those out, even though it is real revenue, and it does come to the city, the result of these audits that the state does. But for purposes of trying to get a feel for what's going on today in the local economy, we remove those, filter out those audit figures.
Okay. And the second question, when we did our budget originally, we were projecting to spend down some of our reserves a little bit. Will that be happening this year, or how is that looking?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, I suppose, by the end of the year. Just where we will end up. You're correct. The original budget included about a $3.8 million use of fund balance to balance the budget. Now, typically, when we have done that in the past, and that's a number that's consistent with the last several years, we actually ended up putting money into reserves, and that will happen at least in the last few years as a result of really two things. One, sales tax revenues coming in higher than anticipated will reduce the amount of fund balance that we would otherwise have to use. And then, as luck would have it, the last couple of years we've spent considerably less than what we've budgeted for snow removal, and so we aren't spending as much as we have budgeted for a lot of things, but particularly snow removal turns into a significant number. The way we're moving this year, at this point, we haven't really spent a lot of money on snow removal, but as you all know, that can change in a hurry, and that's really because we're on a calendar year, fiscal year budget. It's a difficult thing to really predict right up to the end of the year, because as I think it was in 2009, the city had a a very big snowstorm at the very end of the year, and that can skew your numbers by a long shot. So right now we're looking very good. I think the projection as it relates to Operation Timber Strike was that we would have about a $1.2 million impact on our fund balance. But with sales taxes running ahead of budget, and at least for now anyway, it looks like snow removal costs are going to potentially be below budget. Things look pretty positive, I would say.
So we probably will not end up spending that, or will
I would, well, I would be shocked if it would hit that $3.8 million. It certainly, you know, if we have a normal snow season for the rest of this calendar year, I could see we could get somewhere close to a break-even point where we're not using any fund balance, but we're not putting anything in either.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Anderson Jr.
Thanks, Dean, because you brought up a question in my mind as you were asking that. Tracy, as we get closer to the end of the year, how are we looking at our reserve as far as keeping it above that 25%?
Very good. Yeah, I think when we adopted the 14 budget, the projection was to end 2013 with a reserve of about 30% of our expenditure budget. So I think we're on track to be looking that good or potentially better. Again, it depends a lot on what happens the last 2 months of this calendar year.
Thank you.
Councillor Jameson.
Tracy, just glaring at this sales tax growth chart in front of us, do you have any recollection in the history that you can see the 7.6? What's the highest it's ever been? That's quite a number, 7.6.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. Historically, like I say, the 10 years essentially prior to the recession, the average annual growth was a little over 6%, between 6 and 6.5%. So I'm sure there were some years in that 10-year time frame when it was well above 6, and others when it was below. But yeah, I don't know what the real high water mark is, but certainly 7.6% is a pretty strong growth rate in a community our size.
And really 8% doesn't seem that far out of question. Really?
No, I mean we've seen it go up an awful lot in the last 6 months. So I mean, but it can turn around in a hurry too. We've seen that happen in the past, and I think that's something we don't want to lose sight of either.
Thank you, Director Turbach.
Okay, thank you.
Our last presentation is going to be by Councillor Kermit Staggers on his American Dream Coalition 2013 conference. Councillor Staggers.
Well, good afternoon to my fellow council members and also to the people in the audience. People watching on TV are probably wondering, what am I doing up here? This isn't normal during an informational. Well, let me mention that recently the City Council passed a policy that whenever a council member would go to a conference, we would have to report back on the conference. And that's what I'm doing this afternoon, reporting on my attendance at a conference in Washington, D.C., October 27th to October 29th. A conference sponsored by the American Dream Coalition. Now, before I say something specific about the conference, let me just mention something briefly about the coalition itself. By the name, it's obvious that the American Dream Coalition is focused on the American dream. Well, what is the American dream? It can mean many different things to different people. However, there are two elements for the American Dream Coalition that they focus on. First of all, they focus on affordable housing, that families and people can own their own homes. And in doing this, they focus on markets, not mandates. Secondly, the American Dream Coalition focuses on having the mobility to get where you want to go. And of course, this is quite relevant here in Sioux Falls as we continue to grow and get more congestion. The American Dream Coalition wants a transportation system that has little or no congestion. Now, to the conference itself in Washington, D.C. This was the 9th national conference I've attended every one of their conferences. On the first day of the conference, we had an all-day bus tour. The first stop on the bus tour was in Northern Virginia, Arlington County, at the $1 Million Bus Stop. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the $1 Million Bus Stop, but this was reported in the Washington Post some time ago, where the federal government had given out grants, 12 grants of $1 million each for these bus stops. So we went there to take a look at it. Now, before we got there, I had all these preconceptions of what a $1 million bus stop would look like. You know, I was thinking, well, maybe they'll have a building like our Southwest Transfer Facility building. That only cost a few $100,000, but I thought, well, this is going to be an elaborate $1 million building. Well, to my great surprise, there was no building there at all. It was truly a bus stop, a bench, now a very nice bench, and then it had a cover over to protect people from the rain or whatever. That was it. Now, you have to wonder how they got $1 million out of this. And in taking a closer look at it, there were a number of electronic devices associated with the bus stop. But still, I still don't understand how they came up with $1 million. And of course, the writer of the Washington Post story couldn't understand how they spent $1 million on that. Well, after spending $1 million on this one bus stop, they did not continue building other $1 million bus stops. That was it. From the $1 million bus stop, we continued traveling in Northern Virginia. Next, we looked at the Silver Metro Rail. Now, the Silver Metro Rail is having the metro system, the subway system, go from Dulles International Airport to downtown Washington, D.C. And that project should be done around 2018. However, when I was looking at the Metro Rail project, I was thinking of our South Dakota 100. You know, we're thinking of spending millions and millions of dollars on the South Dakota 100. Here, they're thinking of spending billions of dollars, $6.8 billion. From the Metro Rail, we visited a control center for a privately owned hot lane. Now, in case you don't know what a hot lane is, it's a high occupancy toll lane that's on major highways or major arteries into Washington, D.C. This control center was owned by an Australian company. In fact, they owned the hot lane itself. And so the way this hot lane worked is that during rush hour, the cost for riding your vehicle in the hot lane was maybe $10. When there was no rush hour, you could ride in the hot lane for about 2 hours. So this was an Australian company, and they're trying to make money off of this. It's been in operation just for a few months. Later in the day, we traveled north of Washington, D.C. in Maryland to see the Inter-County Connector toll road. It had just opened, and we were able to ride on it. It's a very, very nice highway. However, my lesson that I learned from this toll road is that apparently in the Washington, D.C. area, they still can't get enough money to build everything they want. And so they had to rely here on this toll road. After the first day of travel, the rest of the conference was devoted to speakers and workshops. The participants represented various businesses, government agencies, and think tanks. We had about 24 diverse speakers. And let me just briefly give you a sample of some of these speakers. One speaker I was particularly fascinated with was Dale Mosier. Dale Mosier is the Chief Executive Officer of Megabus. I don't know, anybody ever heard of Megabus before? Well, Megabus is an inner-city bus line that operates in the Northeast, Southeast, and also in the West. It's a British company that started in the United States in 2006. Megabus is noted for double-decker buses, Wi-Fi service, and also dollar fares. The closest that Megabus operates to Sioux Falls is Omaha. You can go from Omaha to Chicago, or you can go up to Minneapolis and go from Minneapolis to Chicago. And when you take a look at pictures of megabuses, they're very fascinating. And so maybe one of these days we'll get Megabus coming to Sioux Falls. A second speaker is Stanley Kurtz with the Ethics and Policy Center. And the major focus of Stanley Kurtz's presentation was the policy of the federal government right now in regard to helping urban centers, large cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and so forth and so forth. Kurtz is contending that the federal government is devoting a lot of resources into the large urban centers at the expense of suburbs and small communities like Sioux Falls. So if that's true, we're going to have to simply be aware of this, that when we try to get money from the federal government, there's also a tendency to want to help the urban centers rather than communities like Sioux Falls. Another speaker was Robert Poole with the Reason Foundation, and he talked about the obsolescence of the gas tax. And probably many of you have heard of this already because of the efficiency of our automobiles. We have electric vehicles now and so forth. We're actually using, somewhat less gasoline than we would normally use in the past. And this is affecting the gas tax. And what's going to happen in the future as we become more and more efficient with automobiles and other vehicles? We need other kinds of financing. And what Robert Poole was talking about was maybe coming up with a system which is technologically possible, is to charge us per mile that we drive. That was his suggestion. I'll have to admit I'm not too much in favor of that, but that's something we will be thinking about and talking about in the future. And then the last speaker I'd like to briefly mention something about is Rick Harrison. And Rick Harrison is from Minneapolis. Excuse me. And Rick Harrison is the president of the Rick Harrison Site Design Studios. In other words, he's involved in land development. During the course of his career, he has helped to develop 670 neighborhoods in 46 states and 13 countries. And in talking with him, I discovered that he has been involved in work in Sioux City, but he hasn't been involved in Sioux Falls yet. So maybe in the future we'll have Rick Harrison down here helping some developers. But he's also published a book, and I purchased this book at the conference, and it's dealing with his they are very unique principles of land use and so forth. And so I brought this book. If anybody would like to take a look at it, they're more than welcome to. Well, this concludes my brief overview of my trip to Washington, D.C., October 27th, October 29th. Does anybody have any questions at this time?
Councilor, or questions of Councilor Staggers? Councilor Erpenbach.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Councilor Staggers. This was really interesting. Thank you for sharing with us. Would
sure.
you tell us the title of the book and say again the author?
Okay. It's an interesting name, Prefurbia.
That's what I thought I could see from
Yeah,
it. Okay.
Prefurbia by Rick Harrison. Now let me see here. I really don't see any particular publisher. But anyway, it's Prefurbia. And I'm just looking on this one page here, and it says Prefurbia is a trademark of Richard Harrison. So watch out.
Created his own word then. In other
Yes,
words,
he
but
created
good.
his own word. But it is a very interesting book here with many pictures and layouts of communities and neighborhoods. And I'll have to admit, I've never seen any of his neighborhoods that are similar to anything in Sioux Falls. So it's very unique. It's focused a lot on sustainability and efficient use of land resources and things like that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councilor Anderson Jr.
Councilor Staggers, one of the things, items that you talked about was affordable housing.
Yes.
What did you see in the differences that were presented there and what we're doing here in Sioux Falls at this time?
Well, at this particular conference, there were not so many examples of differences of what we're doing and what market approach would be. In other conferences that I've attended like this, yeah, there are. And let me just mention one way to bring about more affordable housing is to be aware of the regulation. Because it seems like, every year or so, we have more and more regulations placed on housing. And as more and more regulation is placed on housing, inevitably this results in higher costs. And that's something we should try to avoid. We don't want people, families, paying higher costs for housing when it's not necessary. So that's just a general kind of statement as to how we could help bring about lower housing costs.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councillor Jameson.
I just got to say that, Kermit, you've set the bar pretty high for Councillor Rolfing and his discussion that's going to follow here on his trip to Seattle. So very well done, really.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And next year, the American Dream Coalition meeting is planned for Denver.
Mine will be longer. No.
Councillor Erpenbach.
I just wanted to add that I know Councillor Staggers wasn't excited about making this report, but that's part of what we wanted to be able to share that information.
Oh, no,
just
I don't
really,
mind making the report at all.
Yeah, I really appreciate you doing it. That
sure.
It makes a huge difference to us to go, oh, well, that was what he was doing. That's, I think it's really important for us all to be willing to do that. Thank you.
Councillor Rolfing.
Yeah, one of the things that I got out of the National League of Cities, I got about 4 or 5 different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Did you come out with one idea that you could bring back to Sioux Falls that maybe could be implemented that would make a difference in transportation, in housing, low-income housing, and any of the other things that were discussed there?
Yeah, I guess I would say is that the Stanley Kurtz presentation talking about the policy of the federal government, a policy that's not widely known to the public, that there does seem to be a conscious attempt to funnel lots of resources and so forth into urban centers, into Chicago, into large cities. And this is a zero-sum game, too, because the more you focus your attention to large cities with money and resources and things like that, that means there's less for other communities. There's less for suburbs. So I think that's something we simply have to be aware of.
Councillor Staggers, very well done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very
much.
much.
Taking to put that together and very informative.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. All righty. Any other discussion from the council? Okay. Well, not immediately, but we have a land use committee meeting that will be starting in approximately 10 minutes. We'll call it 4:50, so we will adjourn, and the land use committee meeting will pick up then. Meeting adjourned.